The restaurant glowed with a kind of heavy opulence that seemed designed not to comfort but to intimidate. Chandeliers dripping molten light onto tables dressed in linen white as bone, mahogany gleaming with polish so deep it mirrored every glass, every flicker of candlelight, and the air itself seemed trained to hush, to hold still under the weight of wealth. Conversations lowered unconsciously, the tinkle of cutlery precise and restrained, waiters drifting like shadows rehearsed in silence. Their smiles carefully balanced masks, their movements like ballet steps meant to flatter those who believed themselves worthy of being served in such grandeur, and into that fragile cathedral of decorum stormed a man who carried arrogance like a weapon, his footsteps loud against the marble, each one a drumbeat announcing war, his laughter booming sharp and unnatural, not born from humor but the desperate will to dominate the room, to be seen, and from the moment he entered, conversations stumbled, forks hovered halfway to lips, eyes flicked up in discomfort. For arrogance carries its own atmosphere, a stench that poisons the air, and he carried it like a crown, surveying the room as though measuring his kingdom, eyes skimming across patrons in their diamonds and suits with contempt, and then curling his lips in a smirk that said he owned them all. And though the maitre d' rushed forward with the polished eagerness of one desperate to appease, even his smile trembled under the man's disdain, and so he was led to a table at the center of the room, placed like a throne before an audience, where his voice rose again, snapping fingers, laughing too loudly, dismissing the staff with glances that sliced, and already the atmosphere bent beneath him, and it was toward that table that a waitress turned, a black woman with a dignity so ingrained in her bearing that even in the face of cruelty she seemed carved from something harder than flesh, a woman who had spent years in service to people who demanded invisibility yet punished imperfection, who had swallowed insults and smiled through them, who had learned that dignity is not the absence of humiliation but the refusal to surrender one's soul to it, and she walked toward him with the steady grace of someone who had faced storms before, leather-bound menu balanced in her hand, her eyes calm though her chest whispered of warning, for she recognized his type at once, the kind of man who believed that humiliation was entertainment, that snapping fingers was proof of power, the kind of man who equated cruelty with charm, and when she set the menu before him, he did not thank her, did not even glance at her face, only flicked his wrist as though swatting a fly, his eyes scanning the room for witnesses to his performance, and when she asked softly, "Would you like water to begin?" his lips twisted into a sneer and he said loudly enough for half the room to hear, "Of course I want water, do you think I came here to dehydrate?" And a ripple of discomfort passed across nearby tables, heads bent, eyes dropped, but he basked in it, fed on it, leaning back as though he had just delivered something clever, while she only inclined her head, not flinching, not giving him the satisfaction of reaction, turning away with elegance intact, repeating to herself the words her mother had once told her, "They will try to make you small, but your dignity is not theirs to take," and as she poured chilled water into crystal, her hands steady, she returned with the tray balanced perfectly, lowering the glass with flawless care, and he snatched it before her hand had even withdrawn, raising it theatrically to his lips, gulping loud, deliberately grotesque, before slamming it down so hard droplets leapt into the air, staining the tablecloth with dark patches, and then, with a flick of his wrist, he sent the remaining water flying, droplets catching chandelier light like shattered jewels before splashing across her blouse, her apron, her skin, cold shock biting against her chest, and gasps erupted across the restaurant, silence collapsing heavy as stone, the piano in the corner still playing absurdly cheerful notes against the violence of the act, and she stood dripping, tray trembling though she forced her grip firm, eyes locked not on the mess but on the man, who leaned back with a predator's smile, lips gleaming with satisfaction, as though he had purchased with his money the right to demean. As though he believed her humiliation was proof of his power, and yet she did not speak, did not crumble, her lips pressing into a line of iron, and in her eyes a fire burned, not the weakness he craved but a storm he could not imagine, a storm that would not forgive, and as water dripped onto the marble, pooling at her feet, the restaurant held its breath, the other patrons paralyzed between shame and cowardice, unwilling to interfere yet unable to look away, and he laughed, the sound brittle, hollow, echoing in a silence that no longer admired him, that no longer found him commanding but grotesque, though he did not yet realize it, drunk on his own performance, waving dismissively for the manager, who hurried forward, face pale, torn between appeasing the customer who paid the bills and acknowledging the waitress who carried the dignity of the room on her soaked shoulders, and the arrogant man, gesturing with mock innocence, declared, "She can't even carry water without spilling it. Is this the best you've got?" And though the words were venom, the lie obvious, the manager's mouth faltered open, closed again, eyes darting helplessly, but before the silence could seal its complicity, before injustice could root itself into another night, the door at the far end of the restaurant groaned open, and a sound rose that did not belong to chandeliers and champagne, a caw sharp and cutting, the cry of a crow, so out of place it cleaved the room in two, and every head turned as eye Man stepped inside, cloaked in black from boots to collar, shoulders squared beneath the weight of something darker, something older, and on his shoulder perched a bird, feathers glistening like oil in candlelight, eyes like burning coals, and the restaurant forgot its wealth, forgot its etiquette, forgot even to breathe, because myth had entered flesh, silence had grown wings, and the waitress, dripping and rigid with restraint, felt her heart pound once in recognition, because she knew that silhouette, knew the gate, knew that she was no longer alone, that her husband had arrived, a man whose legend preceded him, a man who had chosen to wear the crow not as ornament but as omen, and though he had not yet spoken, though he had not yet advanced, his very presence bent the air, rewrote the script of the evening, pinned the arrogant guest to his seat with a gaze like iron nails, and the smirk that had ruled the night faltered, trembled, tried to resurrect itself but fell thin, for the silence was no longer indulgent but accusatory, no longer the silence of wealth but of judgment, and the crow tilted its head and screamed again, a sound that tore through glass and guilt and pride alike, and in that sound the patrons felt destiny stirring, the arrogant man's laughter choking dry in his throat, his arrogance shriveling like paper near flame, and the waitress, still soaked, still upright, felt the heat of her husband's eyes not on her shame but her strength, as if he saw only the dignity she had refused to surrender, and in that moment the humiliation collapsed back on the man who had cast it, a weight that would crush him before the night was over, and though no hand had yet been raised, though no blow yet struck, the room knew that the storm had arrived, and it wore black feathers, it carried silence like a blade, and it had come not for spectacle but for reckoning. The waitress stood there with her blouse still wet and clinging to her skin, the cold shock of the arrogant guest's cruelty soaking through her but never reaching the fire that burned at her core, and though the entire restaurant seemed to shrink away in cowardly silence, she carried herself with the kind of unbroken poise that only comes from years of being tested, years of serving people who saw her not as a human being but as a vessel for their whims, years of swallowing words that cut sharper than knives, of bowing without breaking, of smiling while her heart raged, and it was in that moment, when water dripped from her apron to the marble floor, that the full force of her dignity revealed itself, for instead of collapsing under the humiliation meant to strip her, she became something unmovable, a pillar in the storm, her back straighter, her chin slightly lifted, her silence heavier than any shouted protest could have been, and though the arrogant man smirked at what he thought was her defeat, the truth was that every eye in the room, every hidden conscience, now bent toward her, not him. Because even those too afraid to intervene could feel it, that her dignity had survived unbroken, that what dripped onto the floor was only water, not her pride, and as she breathed deeply, remembering her mother's words from childhood, dignity is your inheritance, child. Don't ever trade it for the crumbs of someone else's approval, she felt that inheritance rise inside her, wrapping around her like a cloak, invisible yet undeniable, and the room began to shift, subtly, imperceptibly at first, the silence no longer the silence of complicity but of awe, as if every patron suddenly realized that they were watching something ancient unfold, the age-old battle between arrogance and dignity, cruelty and strength, and the arrogant guest, though still drunk on his own performance, began to sense it too, because arrogance thrives on breaking others, and when it does not succeed, when its cruelty lands but does not wound, it falters, it grows restless, it hungers for escalation, and so his laughter grew louder, emptier, his gestures wilder, his insults sharper, but all of it bounced off the steel wall of her composure, and with every failed attempt to diminish her, it was he who looked smaller, his shadow shrinking even as he tried to expand it, while she grew larger in the eyes of everyone present, the soaked blouse clinging not like a mark of shame but like the robes of a warrior returning from battle, her silence no longer a void but a roar too profound for words, and when her husband entered, cloaked in black with the crow perched upon his shoulder, the weight of her dignity only amplified, because the storm she had carried quietly inside her heart now had a voice, now had wings, now had a presence that turned myth into flesh, but even before he spoke, before he confronted the man who had humiliated her, it was her stillness, her refusal to shatter, that defined the room, that shifted the narrative, that transformed her from waitress to legend, and in the collective breath of the onlookers there was a recognition, unspoken yet undeniable, that true power does not scream or belittle, true power does not humiliate or sneer, true power is the strength to remain whole when someone tries to reduce you, the strength to hold your head high while others attempt to bow it, and she embodied that strength now so completely that it radiated. Her very posture accusing every silent witness, her unbroken gaze condemning the cowardice of those who had looked away, and yet it was not anger that defined her but resolve, not bitterness but a calm deeper than the cruelty that sought to undo her, and as her husband advanced, the crow crying its jagged note, she stood not as a victim waiting for rescue but as a woman who had already won, whose dignity had already triumphed, whose silence had already unmasked the true weakness of her tormentor, and though words would follow, though confrontation would ignite and escalate, the truth had already been spoken in the language of her composure, and that truth was this: arrogance is loud but fragile, cruelty is sharp but hollow, and dignity, though quiet, though unassuming, though dressed in the uniform of a waitress in a world that refuses to see her, is indestructible, immortal, the one thing that cannot be stolen even by the cruelest hand. And in that recognition, in that moment heavy as prophecy, the restaurant itself seemed to bend toward her, as though history had chosen its witness and its hero, and she, soaked and silent, bore it with the grace of someone who knew that storms pass, but dignity endures forever. The room had already been shaken by the splash of water, by the silence that followed, by the waitress standing drenched but unbroken, and yet the true moment of humiliation had not even arrived, for arrogance is never satisfied with a single cruelty, it festers, it grows, it demands escalation until it consumes everything around it, and the arrogant guest, seated like a king among cowards, felt the need to deepen his performance, to carve his name into the evening through an act so grotesque. It would be remembered not as indulgence but as infamy, and so, as the manager hovered helpless, torn between appeasing money and defending dignity, the guest leaned back in his chair with the lazy posture of entitlement, his eyes glinting with the hunger of a predator that had tasted blood but not yet filled its stomach, and he called loudly enough for the nearest tables to hear, "Bring me wine, the most expensive bottle you have, perhaps that will wash away this waitress's clumsiness," and though his words dripped with venom, his audience remained still, their shame palpable, their cowardice louder than protest, and the waitress, her uniform damp and heavy against her skin, turned silently to fetch what he demanded, not out of obedience but out of defiance, for she knew that dignity does not crumble when forced to serve cruelty, dignity reveals itself by refusing to break even in chains, and as she carried the bottle back, her hand steady though her chest burned, she could feel every eye in the room pressed upon her, watching, judging, some pitying, some complicit, but none strong enough to stand, and when she arrived at his table, he smirked as though victory were already his, as though she were already conquered, and with deliberate slowness she poured the wine into his crystal glass, the deep red liquid catching the chandelier light like spilled blood, and for a moment, just a moment, the theater of civility returned, but arrogance thrives not on civility, it thrives on cruelty, and so he raised the glass, swirled it dramatically, sniffed, sipped, then spat it back into the glass with an exaggerated grimace, declaring loudly, "This tastes like something she would serve in a gutter," his insult slicing not only at the wine but at her, and the manager. He escalated again, before the manager could intervene, he flung it across the table, wine exploding like a crimson storm across her uniform, staining it deep red, dripping down her arms, a grotesque parody of blood, and the room gasped as one, the silence now suffocating, the music in the corner dying mid-note as the pianist faltered, and she stood drenched again, now not only with water but with wine, humiliation layered upon humiliation, and yet still she did not break, still she did not collapse, and in that moment her refusal to crumble transformed the act itself, because what was meant to diminish her instead diminished him, what was meant to stain her soul instead stained his reputation, and though he laughed, the sound was brittle, hollow, desperate, the laughter of a man who sensed, deep inside, that the room no longer admired his power but recoiled from it, that every eye was no longer on her but on him, judging, condemning, and as she lifted her chin ever so slightly, standing taller beneath the weight of his cruelty, the humiliation inverted, the theater collapsed, and he, though seated, was suddenly the smallest man in the room, his arrogance exposed for what it was, weakness dressed as power, cowardice dressed as dominance, and when the crow on her husband's shoulder let out a cry that rattled glasses and shivered spines, it was as if the world itself declared the verdict, as if nature itself refused to let the moment pass unmarked, and the waitress, though silent, though soaked, radiated a dignity so profound that it burned brighter than the chandeliers, and everyone present knew that the moment of humiliation had shifted, that it no longer belonged to her but to him, that his cruelty had boomeranged back, branding him forever, and the night, though far from over, had already delivered its judgment. The chandeliers that once glowed with golden majesty seemed to flicker in unease as if the room itself had grown aware that it was no longer a sanctuary of wealth but a courtroom for the soul, and every patron sat in frozen witness as the arrogant guest, still pretending at power but paling under the weight of unseen judgment, tried to raise his voice again, tried to make a joke about birds belonging in barns not restaurants, but his words landed flat, brittle things that cracked in the air and fell lifeless at his feet, and the crow on the shoulder of the waitress's husband tilted its head with a stare so sharp it felt like a blade, its black feathers glinting like obsidian, its cry cutting through the room again and making glasses tremble as if even crystal recognized the omen, and the husband stepped forward slowly, every stride deliberate, every movement controlled, a man carrying with him not rage but something heavier, the calm of reckoning, the inevitability of justice arriving. late but unstoppable, and though his presence loomed like a storm cloud swallowing the sun, he did not immediately speak, for silence was its own weapon. Silence allowed the arrogant man to sweat, to twitch, to squirm beneath the gaze of both man and bird, and the waitress, though drenched in water and wine, stood straighter than ever, her chest rising with breath not of shame but of defiance, for she knew now that her storm was not just hers, that she was not alone in facing cruelty, that she carried her husband's presence, the crow's shadow, and even the restless guilt of the silent witnesses who now shifted uncomfortably in their chairs, wishing they had acted but knowing it was too late to claim courage after the moment had passed. And finally the husband's voice emerged, low, steady, a voice that did not rise to shout but sank deep, shaking marrow. "You think you've humiliated her," he said, his eyes never leaving the man cowering behind his smirk, "but what you've shown the world is the weakness in yourself." And the guest scoffed, a desperate sound, grasping for bravado. "Weakness? I'm the one with the glass in my hand, I'm the one who—" But the words choked as the crow shrieked, wings flaring, feathers rustling against crystal and candle flame, and the husband leaned closer, his shadow swallowing the table. "You threw water to drench her, you spilled wine to stain her, but what drips from you now is fear, and it stains deeper than any red." And a murmur rippled across the restaurant, low gasps and shifting chairs. Because it was true, they could all see it, the sweat shining at the arrogant guest's temple, the stiffness in his jaw, the twitch of his hand that betrayed his unraveling composure, and still the waitress had not spoken, still she stood silent but unbroken, her silence now a crown heavier than any jewel, and the husband, gesturing slightly to her, said, "Look at her, drenched but not destroyed, stained but not shattered, she stands taller than you ever will." And the words hit the arrogant man harder than any fist could, because humiliation thrives on compliance, but she had denied him that. She had denied him victory, and now, before every witness, her dignity had become his shame, and yet arrogance dies slowly, clawing at air as it drowns. So he tried again to sneer, tried again to raise his voice. "She's nothing, she's a waitress, a servant," and his words snapped like brittle twigs, because no one in the room believed them anymore, not even himself, and the husband's hand reached out, not to strike but to take the crow gently from his shoulder, lifting the black bird as though it were a living judgment, and as the feathers rustled, the crow let out a final cry, piercing, endless, a sound that seemed to echo not only through the restaurant but through every silent conscience present, and glasses rattled, plates quivered, chandeliers trembled, as though the very foundations of the building recoiled from arrogance, and the husband set the crow on the center of the table before the arrogant man, its eyes burning like coals, its beak clicking sharply, and in that strange, surreal tableau, humiliation reached its peak, because the man who had wielded cruelty so easily now sat pale, sweating, shrinking before a bird, before a waitress, before a truth he could not escape, and though no blow had been struck, though no blood had been shed, everyone in that gilded room knew they had witnessed a collapse, the collapse of arrogance, the crowning of dignity, the inversion of power, and as silence stretched, suffocating and holy, the arrogant guest finally broke, his smirk vanishing, his laugh dying, his eyes darting desperately around the room in search of allies, but none met his gaze, none would claim him, because humiliation had branded him, and he was left naked beneath its mark. And the waitress, at last, allowed herself a single step forward, her voice steady, low, carrying more weight than all his shouts combined. "You spilled water and wine, but what you cannot spill is my dignity, and that is what you fear." And the words, simple yet searing, ignited the air, and the room erupted not in applause but in breath, the breath of witnesses who had held it too long, the release of guilt, the acknowledgement of truth, and the arrogant man slumped, shoulders caving, head bowing, not out of respect but out of defeat, because humiliation had finally found its home, and it would live in him forever. The restaurant held its breath as if the chandeliers themselves had grown weary of pretending to shine for cruelty, their golden light dimming beneath the weight of what was unfolding, and the arrogant guest, once so loud, once so proud, now sat slouched in his chair, his eyes darting with the desperation of a cornered animal, his lips twitching as he tried and failed to resurrect the smirk that had once ruled the night, because the power he thought eternal had evaporated in a single moment. The moment when the water and wine he hurled meant to drown dignity had instead unveiled it, and though humiliation had already branded him, this was something different, heavier, deeper. This was the turning point, and everyone in the room could feel it ripple through them like an unseen wind. And the waitress, drenched but unbroken, her blouse clinging to her frame like a robe of battle scars, became not a servant but a sovereign in that instant, her silence an empire, her composure a fortress. And though she had spoken few words, though her mouth remained closed in defiance, her very presence declared the truth, that cruelty had failed, that arrogance had cracked, that dignity had risen, and it was this recognition that spread across the faces of the silent patrons, their earlier cowardice beginning to wither under the pressure of her example, and as they shifted in their seats, some averting their eyes, others blinking back shame, the arrogant guest sensed the room slipping away from him, and so in desperation he slammed his palm against the table, glasses rattling, silverware jumping, and he barked, "All of you sit there like sheep, don't you see what she is? Don't you see she's beneath us?" His voice climbing, his words meant to claw back authority, but the sound rang hollow, desperate, stripped of its former grandeur, and even he seemed to hear the fragility in it, because his voice cracked on the last syllable, and the silence that followed was not the silence of submission but of condemnation, the silence of a jury that has already reached its verdict, and in that silence the waitress's husband stepped forward again, the crow shifting on his shoulder, feathers rustling like storm winds, and when he spoke, his words did not thunder but pressed into the marrow of every listener. "The moment you raised your hand to mock her, you revealed yourself, and every attempt you've made since has only deepened your shame, because look at her," he gestured with the faintest nod, "drenched in what you meant as humiliation, and yet she stands untouched, unbroken, greater than you could ever dream to be." And the crow cried then, a jagged note that sliced through air and bone alike, and the arrogant man flinched visibly, his hand jerking back from the table as though struck, and whispers began to ripple among the patrons, not loud enough to form words but heavy enough to shift the atmosphere, murmurs of guilt, of recognition, of awe, and the waitress at last moved, lifting her tray and placing it carefully onto the table before her tormentor, a gesture so simple yet so monumental that the arrogant man recoiled, because in that movement was not servitude but sovereignty, not surrender but reclamation, and he saw in her eyes not defeat but judgment, and he could not bear it, and so he spat. "You think you've won something here? You think standing there wet makes you powerful? You're nothing, nothing." But his words wavered, faltered, because even he no longer believed them, and the husband leaned closer, his shadow covering the table, his voice steady as stone. "You don't understand yet, do you? This is the turning point, not just for her, not just for you, but for every coward who sat silent tonight, for every witness who swallowed their tongue when dignity was attacked. This moment will echo, because humiliation was your weapon, and it has broken in your hand, and now you sit weaponless, naked in your arrogance." And the crow let out another cry, wings half spread, and the chandeliers swayed slightly as though trembling under its sound, and the waitress, still silent, still calm, let her chin rise a fraction, and that subtle lift was more powerful than 1,000 shouted accusations, for in it lay victory, unspoken but undeniable, and the patrons, one by one, began to shift again, this time not in cowardice but in quiet allegiance, a woman in pearls whispering to her husband, a young man setting his fork down with trembling hands, an older gentleman nodding almost imperceptibly toward the waitress as though saluting her dignity, and the arrogant guest saw it, felt it, panicked by it, because the room no longer orbited his cruelty, it orbited her strength, and in desperation he rose from his chair, his body shaking, his voice cracking as he shouted, "I will not be made a fool of. I will not." But the words rang like broken glass, sharp yet useless, and he looked not like a king but like a child, throwing tantrums in front of a crowd that had already judged him, and the waitress did not move, did not speak, only stared, and in that stare he collapsed inward, shoulders sagging, chest heaving, because humiliation had been turned, reversed, sharpened into a blade that cut only him, and the turning point sealed itself, etched into every mind present, the story no longer his to control, but hers, forever hers. The chandeliers swayed as though disturbed by an invisible wind, their golden light no longer a comfort but a trembling witness to what had taken hold of the restaurant, for the crow upon the husband's shoulder had become more than a bird, it had become a black star around which the room now orbited, its feathers glistening like spilled oil, its eyes burning like coals that refused to cool, and every gaze, even those that tried to look away, was pulled back toward it, because it radiated the aura of omen, the sense that something larger than cruelty, larger than dignity, larger even than justice, had taken root within its small but terrible form, and the arrogant guest, who only moments before had drenched the waitress in water and wine, now sat shrinking into his chair, his body trembling with a fear he tried and failed to disguise as rage, and when the crow opened its beak and let out a cry, the sound was not the natural rasp of a bird but something deeper, something jagged and metallic that seemed to slice through the bones of every person present, a shriek that rattled wineglasses and made the very chandeliers tremble, and in that sound was prophecy, in that sound was judgment, and people clutched at their throats, at their crosses, at their companions' hands, whispering prayers or curses, unsure which would save them, for even the wealthiest among them, even those used to bending the world with money, felt small before the cry, and the husband reached up, his fingers stroking the crow's feathers with reverence, his face solemn as stone, and he spoke, his voice low but carrying, "This bird does not cry without reason, it cries when truth must be told, it cries when arrogance has poisoned the air, it cries when justice demands witness," and the room shuddered beneath his words, because they rang not as rhetoric but as inevitability, and the arrogant guest slammed his trembling hand on the table, rattling silverware, desperate to shatter the spell, and shouted, "It's a trick! Just a trick. A filthy bird and a fool in black playing games, but even he could hear the hollowness of his voice, even he could feel how thin his protest sounded against the weight of the omen, and the crow tilted its head toward him, eyes gleaming with such piercing intelligence that he flinched as though it had spoken his sins aloud, and the waitress, her uniform still dripping but her presence radiant, stepped forward, her voice calm but heavy. "It's not the bird you fear, it's yourself, because it shows you what you really are," and her words, though soft, carried like thunder, and the crowd, who had once been silent cowards, murmured in agreement, some nodding, some clutching their pearls or coats, but all recognizing the truth. And the arrogant man's face paled further, his sweat dripping, his smirk dead, his posture collapsing, because he realized he had been stripped not by fists but by eyes, stripped not by violence but by dignity amplified through omen. And still the crow shrieked, each cry like a nail driven into the coffin of his arrogance, each wingbeat stirring the flames of the candles until they guttered and bent, casting monstrous shadows across the walls, and people whispered legends to themselves, old tales of crows as messengers of death, of reckoning, of fate that could not be escaped. And though no one dared speak it aloud, they all believed it, they all felt it, that the crow had not come by chance, that it had been called, summoned by her dignity, by his cruelty, by the inevitability of balance. And the husband, his eyes steady on the guest, continued, "You drenched her in water, you drowned her in wine, and yet she did not break, she rose, and now this bird cries not for her but for you, because it knows the truth. Your fall has already begun, and it will not stop until you are nothing but a shadow of what you pretended to be." And the crow let out one final shriek, so loud, so piercing, that several glasses cracked, shards scattering across white linen like shattered illusions, and the arrogant guest, broken at last, covered his face with shaking hands, muttering words no one could understand, words perhaps begging, perhaps denying, but all heard them as the language of a man undone. And the waitress stood tall, her chin lifted, her silence now heavier than his shouts, heavier than the room itself. And in that moment, the crow's omen was sealed, not written on paper but etched into every soul who had witnessed it, that cruelty had been overturned, that arrogance had been burned, that dignity had summoned judgment. And though the night was not yet finished, the path had been set, the prophecy sung, and nothing could undo what the omen had declared. The silence after the crow's cry was not merely the absence of sound but a living force that pressed into the chest of every witness, heavy as stone, thick as fog, suffocating in its intensity, the kind of silence that makes even the most powerful feel small. And it was within this silence that the arrogant guest, once the loudest voice in the room, shrank visibly, his fists clenched, his shoulders trembling, his face slick with sweat, for he could feel that something intangible had shifted. That the audience he once commanded had slipped through his grasp, and now he was naked before them, exposed not as a man of strength but as a hollow creature built of noise and cruelty. And the waitress, standing soaked in water and wine, did not move, did not falter, her composure shining brighter than the chandeliers above her, her stillness heavier than the gold frames on the walls. And though she had spoken only a handful of words all night, it was her silence that spoke loudest, her refusal to be broken that shattered the illusion of his power. And the patrons, once complicit in their cowardice, once silent in their fear of offending wealth, now shifted in their seats, their shame visible, their faces pale, for the crow's cry had pierced their consciences, had shattered the fragile lies they told themselves, and now they saw her not as a waitress but as a symbol, a mirror reflecting back to them their own weakness, their own failure to act. And in that recognition the arrogant guest grew desperate, slamming his fist upon the table, the silverware rattling, glasses trembling. But instead of reasserting his dominance, the sound rang hollow, pathetic, like a child's tantrum, and no one flinched, no one bowed to his noise. And in that rejection his arrogance fractured further, so he rose to his feet, his voice cracking as he shouted, "Why do you all stare? Why do you look at me like I am the villain? She's nothing. She is a servant, a shadow, she should know her place." But the silence swallowed his words, suffocated them before they could take root, because everyone in the room already knew the truth, that his cruelty had marked him, that his arrogance had shattered, that the waitress stood taller than him even as she stood drenched in humiliation. And as his voice cracked into shrill desperation, the crow shrieked again, wings flaring, its cry so piercing that one of the chandeliers above quivered, crystals chiming like bells tolling in judgment. And several patrons gasped, some covering their mouths, others clutching their companions' hands, because in that moment it no longer felt like a bird's cry but like fate itself speaking, an ancient voice echoing through marble and glass, declaring the verdict of the night. And into that rupture, the waitress finally let her voice rise, calm but sharp, words cutting cleaner than any blade. "You spilled water, you spilled wine, and now you spill Lies, but nothing you spill can stain me, and the words, though soft, resounded louder than his shouts, louder than the trembling chandeliers, and every patron felt the truth settle in their bones, that dignity cannot be drowned, cannot be stained, cannot be silenced, and the arrogant guest's knees buckled slightly, his hands shaking at his sides, his chest heaving with the weight of defeat, for in her quiet defiance, in her refusal to crumble, she had stripped him of everything he thought made him powerful, and the silence that followed her words was no longer suffocating but liberating, no longer the silence of complicity but the silence of awe, as if the entire room bowed not to wealth, not to arrogance, but to dignity itself, and the waitress stood as its vessel, her soaked blouse clinging to her like the armor of a warrior baptized in fire, her eyes steady, her chin lifted, and the crowd, one by one, began to lean toward her, their shame slowly transforming into reverence, their cowardice into acknowledgement, and though no one yet spoke, their silence was no longer his shield but her crown, and the arrogant guest felt it, felt the weight of every gaze shift, the judgment of every soul fall upon him, and he stumbled back a step, his voice breaking into a whisper only he could hear, and in that whisper, in that collapse, the silence shattered fully, not with noise but with revelation, for everyone present knew that the night had changed forever, that the waitress, though unarmed, though drenched, had risen above humiliation, had turned silence into a weapon, had shattered arrogance without lifting a finger. And in that realization the restaurant itself seemed to bow, chandeliers trembling, candles flickering low, as though the very air paid homage to the truth that could no longer be denied.